On behalf of the Living History program at Duke University, I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Ambassador Paul Nitze. Let me also introduce my fellow panelists. On my extreme right, Professor Richard Stubbing of the Public Policy Department. Next to him is Professor Bruce Kuniholm, also of the Public Policy Department at Duke University. And to my immediate right is Professor Roland of the History Department. I'm Holsti of the Political Science Department at Duke. Ambassador Nitze, I wonder if we might begin by asking you to give us your assessment of the state of the Cold War in 1989.
It's radically changed in '89 from what it was as recently as a year ago, in my estimation, and even more so from what it was 5 years ago, and even more so from what it was 10 years ago. Now, what is the change? The change is that the Soviet Union is a different Soviet Union than it was 10 years ago. Mr. Gorbachev came into power, when was it? In '83, he became Secretary General. And he brought an entirely different attitude to foreign affairs than what had been before. He began slowly, but over time he's changed. And so as you look into the future, the problems that we face in the future are different than they were at that time.
Is the change largely the change of leadership, that is Mr. Gorbachev, or are there also some more fundamental underlying structural changes that have taken place that might persist irrespective of Mr. Gorbachev's political future?
I think the latter. I think they are broader and more fundamental than just Mr. Gorbachev, that he opened the door to those other factors. In other words, I think the main factor is that many Russians in particular are looking inward rather than outward. Originally, during Stalin's day, the main emphasis was looking outward, hoping that eventually the Leninist view that communism would come to be the principal view in the world, and that it would be a world of fellow communist nations. That view has changed now to looking inward to see whether or not the tremendous sacrifices which had been asked of the Soviet people, particularly of the Russians, has been worthwhile, or whether it hasn't really cost too much from the standpoint of the deprivations, both physical and cultural, that have been imposed upon the USSR, whether those really have been, whether that has been worth it when they look inside what has happened to the Soviet Union, to the Russian culture. Is that damage, was that worthwhile, or was it not?
You mentioned Stalin, which brings up a point that, of course, your own career spans much of the period that we have known as the Cold War, the period since World War II. And I wonder if we might begin by asking you to reflect back upon what might have been some of the major events and perhaps some of the major turning points, either turning points, actual turning points, or those that might have been missed during this period of the last 45 years or so.
Well, my mind goes back to the period before Potsdam, during the war. Then it appeared to me that that Stalin was even then showing his true colors. Even then it became evident that Stalin saw the post-war period as merely an extension of the pre-war period and the during the war period. In other words, from his standpoint, the struggle of communism against the rest of the world, or rather to exploit what he thought were the very great opportunities for communism, that was a continuous effort, a continuous program, which began before the war, continued during the war, and continued after the war. So that that was entirely different than the Western attitude. The Western attitude was that here was a crisis requiring intervention in order to contain or to defeat Hitler. And this was a one-time kind of a thing. It was not a continuing struggle for the rest of the war. It was a one-time major effort. But for Stalin, it was just a continuation of the same kind of a program. And those of us who dealt closely with the Russians during the war came to the conclusion that was true. But this was, very few of us had the opportunity to be close enough to the Russians during the war to develop that viewpoint.
There are major differences within the administration, the Roosevelt administration during the wartime years, as people such as yourself and others were looking to the post-war world and thinking about the kind of post-war international system. What kinds of differences, if any, were there about how the U.S.-Soviet relationship might develop? What would be the ways that would be most conducive in terms of American national interest to develop that relationship? As clearly, it would appear that the United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as two of the two major powers after the war.
But Mr. Roosevelt, I think, clearly had the view that the principal task after the war would be to develop good working relations with Stalin's government, with the Soviet government. And this was number one in order to assure a worthwhile peace. And that was the key. This was shared by many people. But others, of course, had the view that the main project after the war was to get the war over and get back to normality, to get everybody back to his peacetime occupations and to liquidate the abnormalities caused by the war as promptly and as successfully as possible. The United States did a brilliant job on that, I think. We returned to a prosperous peacetime economy, very quickly. It was a chaotic approach to the internal transformation of the United States from a wartime economy to a post-war economy. But internationally, how do you do this? And there many had the view that grave errors were made at the conclusion of World War I, which really made World War II, if not inevitable, at least probable. The errors at the Versailles Peace Treaty, the things that Keynes wrote about, and the economic consequences of the peace, all that stream of thought was in many people's minds at the end of World War II as to how do you prevent the errors of World War I, which brought about World War II, from coming to pass after World War II. So that was another important stream of thought. Of course, most people were interested in just getting back to their jobs, their peacetime jobs.
Ambassador Nitze, I'm wondering if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit on your intellectual differences with George Kennan in the 40s, in that early post-war period.
I didn't have any differences with him in the immediate post-war period. I thought he was a great man and thought he saw things much more clearly than almost anybody else. And when I first met him by accident on a train going from New York to Washington, we immediately got along extremely well. I thought he was one of the most intelligent men I'd ever met, and with a broader experience. He'd just returned from having a tour of duty in Moscow and then in Portugal, as I remember it. But I was fascinated by his ideas and thought they were very profound, and much more profound than anything I'd heard from anybody else about how to deal with the post-war era. So we started off being very close together. He asked me to come and be his deputy when the policy planning staff was created, but Atchison, whom I'd known ever since my childhood, thought I was merely a Wall Street operator and wouldn't be any good for long-term thinking. And so he advised George not to have anything to do with this not somebody who wasn't, in his mind, a long-range thinker. So I was blackballed by Atchison initially. But then when Atchison went back to his law firm for a while, the coast was clear, and so George asked me to join him, so I did. So I was there when Atchison came back later. And then there was a difference of opinion amongst the three of us as to what the implications were of the Soviets having developed a nuclear weapon. What did that mean for our post-war, our continuing foreign policy and our relations with the Soviet Union? And Dean and I thought that what we needed to do was to gradually shift the emphasis of our defense from nuclear to conventional weapons. But if one ought to do that gradually, one ought to do it only as possible. And this is going to be a long-term project. In the meantime, that we ought to maintain and develop our nuclear capabilities. And George felt that one shouldn't do that, he'd come to the conclusion that the possession of nuclear weapons was in itself really a temptation to evil, that these weapons were bad things, and we ought to get away from nuclear weapons right then and there. So a difference occurred amongst the three of us, and we three of us put this down in paper, as I remember it. And Dean's paper and my paper were more or less similar, and George's was quite different. And at that time, I think Acheson sided with me rather than George.
Over the years, when there was a question of how we would implement containment, did you have ongoing discussions with George Kennan about how one would go about doing this kind of thing?
From time to time, I remember a luncheon in, I guess it was June of 1950, or 49 maybe. In any case, it was the year after George had left us to go to the Princeton School of Advanced Studies. And Dean, he said he called up Dean and said he was going to be there one day in June, and Dean asked him to have lunch, and so the three of us had lunch together. And George began the conversation by saying when he had left us and gone to Princeton, it never occurred to him that the two of us would make policy without consulting him. And he was really shocked by the idea. But that's the way it was.
I guess what I wanted just to pursue a little bit was the extent to which, in your judgment, Kennan's perception of containment was more political than military, and what his grasp of the military implications of the containment doctrine were.
Well, all three of us agreed originally that the problem was basically political, to some extent economic. I'm talking about the period, when we were developing the Marshall Plan and so forth and so on. Because we did have a monopoly in nuclear weapons up to this time in '49, when we found that the Soviets had, earlier than we had foreseen, developed nuclear weapons of its own. So up to that time, there wasn't any difference of opinion between us. The problem was basically political and part economic. It was only after the Soviets developed their nuclear weapons that the question of the military really arose seriously. So that's when we first addressed those problems. Now, as to George's views as to what was necessary in the form of military forces in order to maintain deterrence, maintain containment during that period, he thought that two high-quality Marine divisions, and I have a high regard for the Marines, he thought that was necessary. That was all that was necessary for the military containment of the Soviet Union. And this seemed to me to be quite wrong, that if we really did get into a serious disagreement with the Soviet Union involving military forces, then the military forces one would need had to bear some relation to the military capabilities of the Soviet Union in that kind of a situation. And you could imagine many situations in which the geographical content would be grossly disadvantageous to the United States. So that the military potential of the United States that had to be realized and in being, I thought was really quite substantial. And this was totally different than George's view, because he'd come to the conclusion that we certainly should have nothing to do with the nuclear weapons, and then it became dubious as to how much you needed in the way of conventional forces, because you were incapable, you would be incapable of really standing up to the Russians if they had nuclear forces and we did not, because then it would really be totally a political question, not a military question. They would have, the only usable military forces in the world, which I thought was a very dangerous position for us to be in.
One of the remarkable things about the Cold War as a historical period is the extent to which containment as a United States policy has been consistent throughout that period. It is possible to describe the whole period as a manifestation of pursuing a single policy. When you were involved in those early years, in the late 40s and early 50s, in formulating the notion of containment and what that meant both economically and militarily, did you envision a Cold War of the kind that came to pass? Did you see where it was headed at that time?
Well, I remember discussing that with George Kennan once, and asking him how long he thought it would be necessary to maintain a policy of containment before it would have the effect that he hoped for, and that was that if Soviet expansionism was contained, then eventually the people in the Soviet Union would turn inward in their views and see what this was doing to the Soviet Union, and would then come to a different conclusion as to what the basis of their policy ought to be. And I asked him how long he thought that process might take, and he thought it would be, as I remember it, 10 to 15 years. And my recollection is that I said 2 or 3 generations without defining what is a generation.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, that was about the time period we had in mind. Now, it turned out it took longer than that. But I think we were right. You know, when you're sitting here and saying, how long is this going to take? And you come up with someplace between 10 and 40 years, it gives you an intermediate time period. And from that standpoint, I think we were right.
Did you envision the massive strategic arms race that was to take place?
And I thought it was going to be quite serious, yes.
Mm-hmm. In that sense, that is, you were speaking earlier about the buildup of conventional forces to complement the nuclear arsenals that would be necessary. Did you envision that the strategic side of that, the strategic arsenals, would become so large on both sides?
Well, not quite. I can remember once going into exactly that question, how big an inventory of nuclear weapons might be required. And I can remember the Joint Chiefs of Staff had the view that it might be, I think they had a specific figure, 289 nuclear weapons or something like that. And my analysis indicated it would be in the tens of thousands. And so that we finally decided to build the Savannah River plant, which was necessary in the event it was a big inventory we needed. It wouldn't have been necessary if only a small inventory was necessary. And the decision was made to build the Savannah plant. But I don't know that the chiefs ever came around to any, well, I guess they did. They came around eventually to a higher figure, but it took them some time to so do.
Do you remember a specific juncture in the transition from atomic to thermonuclear weapons, a change in policy, that is, a belief that the thermonuclear weapons provided more power and were more practical and less expensive to build for the amount of force that you were going to get out of them, and that changed the complexion of the arsenals that might be developed?
Oh, it did indeed.
Were people conscious of that at the time?
Very much so. There were 3 colonels, I forget their names now. One of them was Colonel Zimmerman, the 3 colonels were attached to the Joint Staff, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they were called the Atomic Colonels, for short, for the 3 of them. And they came around to see me one day, and they were very cross with the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, because they said that here, perfectly clear that thermonuclear weapons were possible, and the Atomic Energy Commission wouldn't proceed with any experiments or any real thought on that prospect of developing thermonuclear weapons. Something had to be done about that, and would I interest myself in it? And I frankly didn't know anything about this until they told me about this prospect. And our consultant to the policy planning staff of the State Department was Robert Oppenheimer. And so I got Robert Oppenheimer in to talk to us about it. And of course, his view was firm on this, that that it was unlikely that a thermonuclear weapon was possible. Just technically, it seemed unlikely. If it did turn out to be possible, as far as he could see, the size of this thing would be so great that no plane could carry it, no other means of transport seemed to be right. Thirdly, if you could find a means of transport, why then the amount of nuclear material, plutonium or uranium, that was required for this thing would be much more effectively used in smaller weapons, in the regular atomic weapons instead of a thermonuclear weapon. And so he said it wasn't a worthwhile thing to do. But then others said, no, it could be possible, particularly teller.
Mhm.
But then Oppie's answer to that was that the Russians can't possibly develop it unless we develop it first and demonstrate the feasibility of this, on the grounds that the Soviets, that they couldn't do it because they didn't let scientists publish their work. And therefore the Soviets wouldn't have the benefit of widely spread information amongst their scientific community of this field of technology or basic physics. Well, we did do this. And this was his main argument, that was that if we went forward with the thermonuclear weapon, why then this would demonstrate the feasibility, and that would get the Russians way ahead of the game.
Mm-hmm.
But
now this discussion was taking place at the same time that NSC 68 was essentially being formulated and drafted in the late 49 and early 1950s.
no, it preceded it
It did. By how much do you?
by a few months,
Mhm.
because this was the reason for the directive from Mr. Truman to us, or to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, to do the analysis that resulted in NSC 68 was as a result of the work we did on whether to proceed with the thermonuclear weapon.
I see.
And as part of the recommendation to Mr. Truman that he ordered the AEC and others to proceed with this development work, I personally inserted into that document, which was given to the President by Mr. Atchison, the recommendation that State and Defense be directed to do a fundamental reassessment of our foreign policy in the light of these possibilities, so that this NSC 68 task resulted from Mr. Truman's decision to go forward with the development at a leisurely pace, not an all-out pace, of a thermonuclear device.
Paul, the period of the last 40 years, and you as the author of NSC 68, or many people would say the seminal work on our policies that we've been following, could you give, since you've been so close to the players that have really mattered, could you give a brief assessment of the performance as you saw it with the threat in mind and what actions were taken by the various presidents that had a big role in it, starting with President Truman, perhaps President Eisenhower, and others, and your assessment of their performance in implementing containment as you saw it, or the threat from the Soviets? Just some vignettes, that would be nice.
Personally, my overall assessment of President Eisenhower was one of gross and radical disappointment. I frankly thought he was one of the poorest presidents we ever had. But I deeply resented the fact that he, even in the days of his greatest popularity, found it inconvenient to stand up for General Marshall against the attacks that McCarthy made on General Marshall. I thought this was unspeakably vile performance on his part. I thought it was also unspeakably vile performance to condemn Mr. Truman's administration for having withdrawn forces from Korea, which General Eisenhower said were the things that brought about the attack by North Korea into South Korea, when it had been General Eisenhower, indubitably, who had been the one who insisted upon the withdrawal of our troops from Korea, against the opposition of Mr. Truman and my opposition in particular at the time when that decision was up. And it was Eisenhower, when he was Chief of Staff, I guess, of the Army, who insisted that they be withdrawn. But there were a series of things which just irritated me so much that I never have been able to forgive Eisenhower since that time. But you asked a different question: who really contributed? And certainly in the Eisenhower regime, an enormous contribution was made to containment, in the sense that more was done about the buildup of our nuclear capabilities during the Eisenhower administration than ever before or since. And the size of the defense budget as a percentage of GNP was higher during that period than it's ever been since. I think, well, maybe during the Korean War it was, well, I guess
Yes, it was higher.
a little higher. But it was, on the average, it was over 10%, as I remember, during the Eisenhower years. So he did, if the question really relates to who contributed to containment, I think one has to say that Eisenhower did. That's quite different than saying you approved of the way he went about it.
How about a couple of the other presidents and their performance? Let me just pick one. You were in the administration of Kennedy Johnson, maybe a vignette on that, and perhaps President Carter when you were on the outside looking in, and their performance.
Well, with respect to the Kennedy years, I was a great admirer of Jack Kennedy. He seemed to me it was his generation that should take the responsibility, not my generation, which was superannuated even then. And so it gave the Kennedy administration gave an entirely fresh breath of life to the country and its view toward foreign policy and policy generally. But when it came to specific strategic guidance, I don't think it was outstanding. He didn't permit anybody really to formally address the formation of policy. He canceled the practice that we'd had up to that time of having an annual work process which resulted in the publication within the government of the successors to NSC 68, so that none of these basic national security policy documents were permitted by Mr. Kennedy. He and some of his advisors, a fellow by the Newhouse, no, that wasn't quite the name, but a name like that. Neustadt really thought that such a document would inhibit his freedom of action, give the bureaucracy a handle on which to constrain his freedom. So he wouldn't permit any such thing to be done, which I thought was a mistake. You can't really run a government, or you can't certainly run an institution as big as the Pentagon without having, in some written form, guidance on the myriad of policy, aspects of policy which they need some guidance on, and this seemed to me to be the best way to do it. But so it was run more out of his head than it was in any organized way, and at least the degree of organization that I thought was necessary for the smooth running of a government.
And Mr. Carter, as president, you were outside the government then, and your assessment of his looking, I know you had different views, but of the Soviet threat.
Originally, we didn't have different views. Originally, I thought he and I were on the same wavelength. And at one point, as I remember it, he was asked during the nomination period, when he hadn't yet been nominated to be the Democratic candidate, somebody asked him who was his advisor on defense matters, and he said Paul Nitze, and then after some hesitation he said, and Paul Warnke. And at that stage I knew there was problems.
Could we get one more and ask you about President Reagan?
He was really an extraordinary person to work for. Frankly, originally I had no great respect for Mr. Reagan's foreign policy judgments, but over a period of time I developed a great deal of respect for them. I think in the debates that he had with Mr. Gorbachev, particularly the last series of debates in connection with the summit meeting in Moscow, and I guess it was in when? May of 88?
Right.
But at that time, Mr. Reagan just went off on an attack of his own, and that was the defense of democratic principles as the fundamental virtue of the liberal countries in the world, and that this was much better than the totalitarian form of government that the Soviets had. And it was a cinch. He carried that debate, and he just won that debate, and he concentrated on that one issue, the superiority of freedom to lack of it. And I thought that was a tremendous accomplishment. Nobody had ever won that hands down the way he won that against Mr. Gorbachev. And he had, Mr. Reagan had conviction and determination and just went at it, and he wasn't embarrassed by the fact that Mr. Gorbachev was off on entirely different tangents. He didn't meet those other tangents. He went off on his own and argued about the things that he thought were important.
In following, just one last question on this general theme, this 40-year period with these different presidents and different views, and your own views on the nuclear buildup, going back to Alex, there are at least some that have a view that much of the buildup in the nuclear arms is a result of an action-reaction syndrome. I'm sure you've been through this argument, which is based on somehow distorted views of what the threat is or what the other person has, and one team does something and the other does the reaction to it. What is, as you look back over this entire period and realize today we have over 50,000 nuclear weapons, were there points at which this might have been done differently as you have a chance to think back, and perhaps things could have changed? Were there any critical points at which maybe this thing didn't have to happen as it did, as you say?
Well, isn't there another way of putting it? You're saying that were there times when we made the wrong decision, when it would have been wiser for us to make the decision to unilaterally cut back on our nuclear production?
All right.
Isn't that, I take it that's what
well,
you're
that's one way of looking at it, yeah. I mean, either side could do it, but sure.
Either side could do it, sure, but it makes a lot of difference is whether we or they. I think it makes all the difference in the world. I don't believe it's just two kind of similar powers. There really was a distinction, and is a distinction, between the two sides. You know, the Communist Party, you know, had really believed in a totalitarian solution. They did believe in outrageous methods of implementing their policies. They were guilty of, you know, murdering 50 million people of their own. They were. It isn't the same as just we and the Soviet Union as two great powers. There really is a distinction between which one had some degree of merit and which one was really a vile organization. There was something to which side you're on. I think, and many people kind of lost any view of that during the course of the discouragement particularly with the Vietnamese War. First, I guess, in the Korean War, where even though the country as a whole was wholly behind the Korean War to a man in the early weeks and months of that, but eventually when the casualties became great and the costs became great, and it seemed to be getting nowhere, then there was deep discouragement with the Korean War. But it didn't really become that serious until the Vietnamese War. And then clearly over half the country it was against the Vietnamese War. So that was a period of enormous strain upon, you know, the containment doctrine. One could have arguments as to whether or not the Vietnamese War was the right way in which to prosecute the containment doctrine. I certainly had that view during the Korean War. I mean, during the Vietnamese War. But many disagreed with that. But still, there are two different problems here, whether it was a wise move consistent with the containment doctrine, which I doubted, or whether it was inherently a totally misguided venture on our part. I don't believe it was a totally misguided venture. It turned out to be a totally unprofitable venture. But those debates in the Vietnamese War, of course, were very destructive of the unity of the United States and very damaging to containment.
You mentioned the Korean War, an earlier war, which ultimately became somewhat unpopular. I wonder if you might just reflect a little bit upon the decision after the Incheon landing was so successful to recross the 38th parallel and not simply redress the status quo, but to reunify Korea, which ultimately found the United States fighting at least an undeclared war with the Chinese. What were your views at the time? What kind of debates took place within the administration on the decision to recross the 38th parallel?
Well, the main debate, obviously, was one between MacArthur and some of the rest of us. After we recrossed the 38th parallel, well, the first question was whether we should cross the 38th parallel. And on that score, you could argue in favor of that, although, you know, what was the name of the Indian ambassador who told us that this would have very deleterious results with respect to the Chinese? I forget his name now. But we had been warned by him that he knew the Chinese well, that the Chinese would not stand by if we got too close to the Chinese border during the course of throwing the North Koreans back. So we from where I sat in the State Department, it was a very touchy situation how to handle this thing. One problem was that if one just stopped at the 38th parallel, then clearly it was foreseeable that the North Koreans would then rebuild their military forces, and they would repair all their airfields, and the Soviets would send them a complete panoply of aircraft to substitute for all those that had been destroyed, and that therefore this confrontation in that part of the world would continue forever. And it required a diversion of forces from what seemed to us to be the main areas of threat of substantial magnitude and extremely costly to do. So it would be much better if you could get a liquidation of the problem, some kind of a settlement of the Korean situation, a definitive settlement, which would demilitarize it or something or other for a period of time. And how could you best go about doing that? And it seemed to me that what one should do is to try to work out some terms which would, in fact, do exactly what I've been talking about, permanently neutralize that area as an area of threat either to us or to those north, the Chinese and the Russians. There it seemed to me we ought to get into negotiation right away by formulating such an offer to the North Koreans. But before we could get that formulated and get this into circulation, why MacArthur cut all this short by announcing his demands for unconditional surrender on the North and so forth and so on. Then to get that unwound was an almost hopeless problem. And so the real question at issue was whether we could get, whether the chiefs would agree to issue an order to the military forces our military forces in Korea to stop at a certain point after they'd thrown back the North Koreans. And there it seemed that the most logical place for them to stop would be at the narrow neck where the military front would be shortest. And the chiefs came around to thinking that was the right view. So then the question was whether they should order MacArthur to stop at that point. And to order MacArthur to stop at that point was contrary to our military doctrine as it had evolved over 100 years. And that military doctrine was that you let the commander in the field decide, have ultimate power of decision over what was necessary at the front, because he was in a better position to judge what the threat was and what the dangers were and what the possibilities were. And the chiefs shouldn't issue any such firm order to stop here, there, or the other place. And General Marshall took this very seriously indeed. So he and the other chiefs were reluctant to order MacArthur not to go beyond the narrow front or any other given place in North Korea. So that I think MacArthur was right when he said that he had never been instructed not to go beyond a given place in North Korea. But the upshot was quite contrary to what the chiefs as a whole and General MacArthur and General Marshall in particular hoped would evolve.
What about the position of the civilians within the government, people such as yourself, Dean Acheson, indeed the President himself? Was there extensive debate about whether such an order should be issued, what the long-term goals that we ought to strive for, how extensive they ought to be in Korea and so on during the fall of 1950?
My recollection is that certainly it was my view, and I believe it was Acheson's view, that General Marshall and the chiefs should in fact order MacArthur not to go beyond the narrow neck in North Korea.
I'm wondering if I can pick up on the Korean issue and raise also an issue you brought up last night, which was your judgment that a real turning point in containment took place in 1983 with the decision to implement the INF decision and then the Soviet turning inward. And I'm wondering whether you could reflect on your 45 years in public service and try and isolate some of the key benchmarks in the evolution of the Cold War during the containment period and focus on those that you think were central in the evolution of that policy. In other words, if 83 is a key turning point, looking backward, what about the Cuban Missile Crisis or Vietnam or Afghanistan or Korea? Which ones, in your experience, were central to your interpretation of the evolution of the Cold War?
Well, I thought the most dangerous period in the Cold War was the period of the Berlin crisis, which preceded by, I guess, a year, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was the period when I was really concerned that Mr. Khrushchev would go forward with his threat, you remember, to turn over to East Germany control of the access routes to Berlin, and that the East Germans would then close those access routes, and we would be faced with really contingency very difficult to figure out how one could get through this without ourselves being prepared to take actions which would be tantamount to creating a war. We would have to resist with force the closing of the access routes to Berlin, was my view of it. And so because the military situation around Berlin was extremely dangerous. Now, they were in command of all the geography, so all the geographic considerations were against us. And at that point in '61, the margin of nuclear superiority we had was nil, or virtually nil. We had, I forget, 1 or 2 submarines, modern nuclear submarines at sea, and I forget it was 1 or 2, but it was a minuscule force. And they had a lot of nuclear capability, certainly in the local area of Berlin, much greater than we. So that, did you want to tangle at that point, in that place, on those grounds? It seemed to me we did not so want to tangle. But on the other hand, it would have been disastrous had we just said, under no circumstances will we resist what you are proposing be done. And so that was a very difficult crisis. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I had no doubt that in Cuba itself, we had local military superiority. After all, the main threat in Cuba itself was from submarines, from Soviet submarines. But our ASW people had, in fact, located all the Soviet submarines that were in that general area, and that caused them all to surface, so we knew where they were. So there wasn't any submarine threat in that area. And there wasn't any air threat, really, because all they would have is long-range aircraft, and we had plenty of aircraft to come and tangle with them. And they would seem to me to be asinine for the Soviets to consider using nuclear weapons. We had, by that time, we built more submarines and were in much better shape strategically than we had been a year earlier. So it seemed to me to be asinine for anybody on the Soviet side to really seriously consider edging toward a crisis which would result in a nuclear war. So frankly, I wasn't scared in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think I was almost the only one who wasn't scared. Well, when I say scared, who really thought...
Scared.
Well, you know what I mean.
Just a quick point of fact, though, that on Bruce's question, in the '61, we had absolute, is this not true? We had absolute nuclear superiority over the Soviets. You didn't mention bombers, where we had thousands, as I remember, 1 or 2 anyhow, of nuclear weapons, and they had just a few. So that in terms of '61 and '62, there was really no change in terms of our nuclear capability.
I did indeed think there was a change.
Even though we had the bombers and they didn't.
We had a lot of bombers, sure.
With nuclear weapons. With nuclear weapons.
Yeah, we had bombers with nuclear weapons, but those bombers in turn were subject to attack by their intermediate range nuclear weapons. And they were on vulnerable air bases. They concentrated initially not on building ICBMs, but they concentrated on building the intermediate range nuclear weapons. So that from where I sat, we were vulnerable to a surprise attack upon our bomber fields or on the perimeter. So that if they initiated and took out our B-17s or whatever we had in those days, B-29s, I guess, or whatever they were.
No, B-47s.
B-47s.
Yes, and some B-52s.
And some B-52s. If they concentrated on taking those out, we would have been in very, very serious problems.
Could I just ask one follow-up question? That is, looking at the period 61, 62 with the Berlin crisis, and then our restraint in the Bay of Pigs ultimately, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, is it possible to see that as a fundamental turning point in the Cold War, where we backed off of the kind of threats that we were perhaps unwilling to push beyond a certain point, and that gradually led to something like 83, where as long as the NATO alliance held, then the Soviets would turn inward?
And I'm not quite sure I get your logic chain, because you say because of the fact that we've exercised restraint in 61, 62.
What I mean by that is we recognized in Berlin in 61 in August that we were in effect de facto accepting something like a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, recognizing the boundaries, the post-World War II boundaries. The Soviets were recognizing in Cuba a de facto American sphere, and there was an understanding that we weren't going to play nuclear hardball, if you will.
Certainly that wasn't my view of our attitude in 61. My attitude in 61 was that even though the military situation was, I thought, adverse to us, the risks were much greater to us than they would be to the Soviet Union in the Berlin situation. It was on the tactical, immediate field. They clearly had clear superiority. In the strategic, I thought it was 50-50, and that the risks involved in our getting ourselves involved in a nuclear confrontation at that time were fully as great or greater for us than I thought they were for the Soviets. But on the other hand, I thought our interest involved, our interest in Berlin not being overrun, was much greater than the Soviet interest in taking it, and that therefore we were entitled to take greater risks than they, and they'd be persuasive to the Soviets, and that if we were courageous enough, we could outface them. But it was a question of, and I thought we could get away with that by not backing down. So we were not about to recognize Berlin as being part of a Soviet sphere of interest, and we never did. That was the whole reason we were prepared to really risk a war in order to keep that Berlin from being within their sphere of influence.
But we weren't willing to push our way through the so-called wall.
The risks were intolerable.
Right.
You know, sure. But it was far from recognizing anything. We didn't want to recognize Soviet a sphere of influence that included Berlin on their side. The last thing in the world we wanted to do would have destroyed the alliance and absolutely ruined containment.
I'm going to use a follow-up chance here for one question I really wanted to get you to answer on the action-reaction. The period that really was of most interest to me was the one that you had suggested, Mr. Eisenhower, and correctly, that Mr. Eisenhower was the source of the biggest buildup in our nuclear inventory. Was that a possible missed opportunity? Looking back, I realize that we're doing that when, after Sputnik, we launched a multitude of programs, as well, we're Army, Navy, Air Force, ballistic missile, intermediate missile, bomber buildup, all the stuff that went on simultaneously. When a missile gap really didn't exist. Actually, it did exist. It was the opposite of what we were advertising at the time. And we had the advantage and the Soviets had none. Was that a possible, and then Mr. McNamara and Kennedy, as you suggested, they came in and turned it off a bit, and then the Soviets reacted. Was that a possible, looking back, problem, the action-reaction? In other words, we built up far much, too fast as you look at it today?
I don't know. I don't believe it's true.
Yeah, I'm asking.
I don't believe it's true. No, one of my friends who was a great student of the Soviet military budget, I think the best on his record, he's by far better than anybody else, It's a fellow by the name of Bill Lee, who used to work for the CIA and got fired because his views were different from those of the majority in the CIA. But Bill did a detailed study about the proposition that the Soviet buildup in nuclear weapons began really with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he finds there's no justification for that at all. He finds no evidence of any programs which were started at that time. The programs were started, in his view, at the preceding year when I guess it was a 7-year plan was approved, and there was a big debate within the Soviet Union about that 7-year plan. And all the decisions which affected their buildup were contained within that 7-year plan and were not as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, that's Bill's view of it.
No, but I was trying to get at, were they the result of our simultaneous buildup of the 4 years prior to that's the point I was trying to get at. So you remember, we started in '58 with this array of programs, and were they not reacting to that? That's what I was trying to get at in the action-reaction.
Well,
what does Bill say, or what do you think about that?
Well, he does, I think, believe that that 7-year plan was in part a reaction to what we decided to do prior to that 7-year plan.
So was that a missed opportunity or not? That's
I don't believe it was a missed opportunity. I think it's one of those things where we would have been hung if we hadn't done it, and we had great problems having done it.
Returning to that notion of major turning points over the period of the Cold War, is there anything between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the great change that you see in 1983 that particularly stands out in your mind, or was that a period of more or less consistent policy on both sides?
Well, I think it was more or less consistent policy on both sides, which went through that entire period of 40 years from Mr. Truman's administration to Mr. Gorbachev's administration.
Any great changes in that particular 20-year block out of it, though, after the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Let me just follow this. What about, for example, arguments that either Vietnam or Afghanistan on one side or another gave each side the sense of its limits, of its capacities to project power? Those kinds of arguments.
Well, certainly, the idea that there were limits on our ability to project our power is a long-standing argument within the U.S. I remember my associate, Charles Burton Marshall, wrote a marvelous book titled The Limits of Foreign Policy, which deals exactly with the limits of our ability to project our power politically. And it's a brilliant book, but that way precedes any of this. I forget when that was written. It must have been written in the 40s, I believe. But so as an idea, the idea that there are meaningful limits upon our ability to project our foreign policy, that is a perfectly sound and solid idea which has been there for a long period of time.
Is it a fair characterization to say that during the 1950s and up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, going through the Berlin crisis of '61, there was a perception abroad by informed people that we were probably headed towards some kind of nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, and the major question was when, and that consistently after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a perception that the two countries were more or less committed to avoiding a nuclear confrontation, and they adjusted the rest of their foreign policy accordingly?
I get disturbed by these extrapolations from a few events to saying that this was some kind of a deal between the U.S. and the
I didn't mean to imply it was a deal, but that it became a common perception on both sides that they better not do that anymore. That course of confrontation was simply too dangerous, and that the two independently came to the conclusion that they had to seek some kind of accommodation.
I don't believe that. I've seen no evidence of it on either side, because I think that truly the aggressor, in quotation marks, the person the country from whom the danger really originated was the USSR. And I don't see any evidence that they had changed their policy in that regard. And that, so that the real question is whether or not it would be wise for us, with no change in Soviet basic policy, for us to change our policy and abandon the policy of containment. I think many people were tempted by that idea. Everybody at one time or another was tempted by that idea. But you know, you try it and you get tripped right away, and so one person after another changed his mind after having tried it.
What about today? Is there, do you believe, you've mentioned Mr. Gorbachev, you've mentioned 1983 as a basic turning point. Has there been a change in perception today about the nature of the Soviet-American relationship in such a way that nuclear confrontation is now seen as a very low probability kind of an event?
I got worried by the phrase perceptions, because frankly, I don't know what is meant by that. Are you supposed to take public opinion polls, or public opinion polls on whom?
Among the top leadership of the two countries, among those who are in a position to make policy and to make critical decisions.
It's very hard for one to know anything about that within the Soviet Union. And it's also hard to know much about it in the United States. It's very hard to determine who really makes these decisions, and you know, what is the process and so forth and so on. So I tend to stay away from perceptions. It seems to me a wilderness. It's much better to, from my standpoint, to address the facts as one knows them, which are, it's always imprecise, you never know them well. But you know, it is more probable that certain things are true than it is that other things are true. You know, you can have an opinion as to the probability of fact, but perceptions I can't deal with.
Let me rephrase the question.
Lead you to how you ought to organize your policy.
Let me rephrase the question a little bit. The late Herman Kahn once is reported to have said that he would pay $5,000 to anyone who would develop a credible scenario of how a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States would start. Now, he was the judge of whether it was credible or not, and he is reported never to have paid the $5,000. I'm asking you, was there ever any, during the last 40 years, a situation in which one could credibly foresee the U.S. and the Soviet Union getting into a nuclear war?
Berlin.
I thought there were.
You've mentioned Berlin as a point
That's
which you were quite scared. What about, well, of course, the Soviets were not nuclear armed in 1948. What was your sense of that particular Berlin confrontation?
48, I mean, as a result of the Korean...
48, the blockade.
Berlin blockade.
The Berlin blockade. I didn't think it was credible that would degenerate into a war between us now. But even though our nuclear panoply at that time was not very great, we couldn't really do much with the nuclear weapons we had. Certainly we didn't have a war-winning nuclear capability, but I still thought it was wholly improbable that it would degenerate into a war.
Although you're not big on perceptions, I've heard you say, do you not think that the Soviet, on that particular Berlin blockade, the Soviet posture might have been at least somewhat affected by their perception that we had more nuclear capability than we had?
And it was also true.
No, I said more than we had.
No, but it wasn't just a perception. They have very good intelligence. And so they know whether we have them or whether we don't. And it's very difficult for us to disguise whether we have nuclear weapons or not. For a long period of time, we tried to have the Soviets believe that we had more nuclear weapons than we did because we were frightened by how small our stockpile was. But by and large, they know pretty damn well and have regularly known pretty damn well what we've had in the way of military capability. So that I again go back to my complete distaste for the word perceptions. Because the prior thing is, what are the facts? And how good are their capabilities of knowing those facts? Those are the things that count.
Ambassador Nitze, Strobe Talbot, in his book Master of the Game, which largely concerns you, writes that after he published Endgame, his first book on arms control, you called him into your office and went over page by page explaining the shortcomings of his analysis. I'm wondering if you could share any judgments with us of his most recent book, Master of the Game.
He didn't do that with that book. I did not go over it page by page, because he knew that I did not want him to write that book. I disliked the title and had a different view. I didn't think he should have written it. So that I have a different feeling about Master of the Game. Obviously, I particularly resent his accusation that I was one of those who were trying to deceive the president. That Bud McFarlane and I had tried to deceive the president, which is totally contrary to fact. Everything that we did in the particular episodes that he is describing, were all cleared by the president. So it is quite incorrect that we were trying to deceive the president. It just isn't so. And he also fails to understand why, after having initially had the view that what they call the conventional interpretation of the ABM Treaty was correct, that after looking into the facts of it and really having read the record of the negotiations, I came to the conclusion that that was wrong, that the narrow interpretation was wrong, that the narrow interpretation was the wrong interpretation, and that the broad interpretation was fully justified. He can't understand why I came to that conclusion. He can't believe that I came to that conclusion because the facts, as I found them out to be, were contrary to my original position. He thinks that I must have had some obscure political reason for changing my mind, and he can't understand what that was. He can't see that it benefited me in any way to have changed my mind on this issue, and it didn't benefit me. It really hurt me in every practical sense you could think of, but it happened to be that I came to the conclusion that the narrow interpretation was just incorrect. There wasn't any basis for it. So that there are a number of other such episodes in the book which irritated me.
I'm wondering if you could address just one of them. As you know, he describes your achievements and distinctions and argues that you're not just master of the game, but victor, ultimately. But he also talks about your prominent role in arms control as being ambiguous. And as he describes it, when outside the government, you were part of the problem, an obstructionist, and even a character assassin, as he would call it, of those trying to advance the process. And then when inside, you were part of the solution. I assume you think this is an unfair accusation. I'm wondering if you could explain the differences in your position inside and outside.
Well, the difference basically was that when I was inside the government, take the original agreements, the ABM Treaty and the interim agreement. On the ABM Treaty, I thought that was a very good treaty. It was not perfect, but it was everything that was in it I thought was correct and was equitable between the two sides. There were gaps in the treaty which we were not in a position when negotiating that treaty to fully understand or to fill in at the time. But with respect to the interim agreement, which was simultaneous with the ABM Treaty, I thought the interim agreement was worthless and was going to do no good to us or hurt us in any way, but I didn't think it was harmful. Therefore, I was for the ratification of both agreements, because one of them I thought was helpful to the United States, the other one I thought was meaningless. Now, with respect to the controversy later on the SALT II agreement, there I thought it was positively fatal if we had entered into that. It would have guaranteed the Soviet Union, I thought, strategic superiority ad infinitum. I couldn't imagine why we would want to enter into that agreement. Now, of course, he interprets this as being that I was in the government in one case and out of the government in the other. I believe that statement is totally unfair. I think it was really on the merits of the two agreements.
Follow on to that specific one, Paul. You've said, and in fact again last night, that the SALT II was disastrous to the U.S. You've said that on many occasions. and yet, and you were certainly a leader in the opposition to the treaty being approved. However, in 1981, you came to a government that in effect allowed the provisions of SALT II to continue for roughly 5 years. And I was wondering, that I guess goes to Bruce's question, how does that square with this? Is this a shifting of positions, or is this something that you could accept and still work for the administration? It was in effect doing what you opposed in the prior administration?
No, I think I was the first during the Reagan years to express that view, that there were only 5 years left under the SALT II agreement, and that during those 5 years there was nothing we could do which was going to change the basic strategic situation, nor that they could do, that they weren't already in the process of doing, that would change the outcome within 5 years.
So weren't you buying what you had said was wrong several years ago?
No, at the original time there was 10 years involved.
The SALT II treaty was 79,
Yeah.
and this was 81 when you came to the Reagan. No, it was in that period. And they did basically, without saying so, both sides kind of followed the outlines that you had opposed vigorously 2 years earlier.
Vigorously opposed. And my opposition and my approval were really based upon another point. And the point was that what was really important in each case was what platform did the SALT II agreement create for the negotiation of SALT III? Because SALT II was going to expire before it did much for you. And I thought the precedent of having agreed to SALT II would have really prejudiced the case for the type of SALT III agreement which I thought we ought to strive for. Now, I didn't think that that was true of continuing to abide by the terms of the unratified SALT II agreement. I thought here you could address, it was more profitable to address directly what the terms should be of a SALT III agreement. And I'd made public my views on that earlier. I thought there was no harm at all in avoiding some of the problems that would exist by starting right then and there to cease to abide by the terms of the SALT II agreement, because there was nothing, as I say, that we could do during that short period which would be in violation of abiding by its terms.
A broader question which involves the role of a powerful figure on the scene, such as yourself, who has been in and out of government. There have been a number of groups that you've worked with or positions you've taken over time that have eventually reached the press. And I'll specifically cite in the late 50s the Gaither report, which speaks to the bomber vulnerability question you talked to earlier, which, if I understand it right, President Eisenhower was not excited about. And that report ended up in the press. In the 1970s, there was the famous Team B intelligence report that eventually reached the press. And in the mid-80s, another Strobe Talbot book, with so many Strobe Talbot books, Deadly Gambits reached of course, reached the public. And you are noted in it as a major source of that. Is that a good role for a public-private figure to be? I don't know who did leak all these things, but nevertheless, is that, in a general sense, is that a good way to conduct public policy, to have highly sensitive kinds of negotiations or reports aired in the public regime?
Depends what you mean by sensitive. If there really is information in it which is contrary to the classification, then of course it should not be done. But I don't believe there was anything in any of these reports you're talking about, the reports about, for instance, the Gaither Committee report. I don't believe there was anything in those stories that came out which was classified.
Those were not sensitive reports. The Gaither and the Team B report on intelligence were not sensitive reports, in your view. Huh? I see.
Wait a minute. What came out about them I didn't think was sensitive.
All right. I see. A final question. If President Bush were to ask you to sit down with him today and lay out kind of a course in the kind of changing climate that we see today with the Soviets particularly and the world in general. Let's just limit it to the world of arms and arms control, which you spoke to last night a bit. What would your advice be to President Bush on the specific steps, seriatim, if you will, that you could see over the next 4 or 5 years that might be a way to move in a somewhat slightly different direction, or whatever direction you think that the country could best do for the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, my view is that basically we're doing the right thing. There is an agenda before us of arms control matters, which really originates from the Reagan administration. We left the arms control business in September of last year with a number of tasks before us. One of them was to complete the START treaty, to try to get resolved the space defense agreement, to work out an agreement on chemical weapons, and to work out an agreement on the reduction, the balancing reduction of conventional arms, amongst an agreement on nuclear testing. All those things were part of the arms control agenda that emerged from the negotiations up to September of last year. And they're all on the agenda right now. And I think the thing to do is to proceed with each one of those items and try to make sense and make progress on those items.
Seriatim, from your vantage and knowledge, would a nuclear agreement be more feasible than a conventional, or is there some step that you would think would be a first step that the nations should take if they were going to do something in these areas? That's what I was trying to get at more.
Well, my view is one ought to proceed concurrently on each one of these items. But the one that I had thought would be perhaps the most difficult to conclude would be the conventional one, because of the fact that that is a multilateral negotiation. In other words, it isn't just USSR versus US. It's between the Warsaw Pact and NATO.
Yes.
And when you have a multilateral kind of an agreement, then any one of many countries can really make trouble and can hold it up for some purpose of their own. So, you know, the difficulty rather expands with the number of parties there are to a negotiation. So I had thought that this would be the most difficult one. But now I think it looks as though this is the one in which the Soviets have the greatest interest, because this is where the money is to be saved. I think they really are pressed by this enormous percentage of their gross national product, which is being diverted from what could be usefully used in other parts of their economy, in which I think they must divert. So that there's enormous pressure upon the Soviet Union to make progress on this so-called balancing reductions in nuclear forces. So when you have enormous pressure on them to move forward on this thing, I think it's easier for us to move forward on it, and therefore I think this is an area which may very well be easier. You can't tell yet because there's so many details and important issues to get from here to an agreement that is mutually acceptable. But I'm more optimistic about that being able to be brought to a finish than I am, for instance, with respect to the START agreement. The START agreement is more complex than the INF agreement. And I think if you want to wrap that one up in a way in which I think such an agreement ought to be wrapped up, in other words, with such detailed work being done on it, that both sides are clear that they fully understand what they're expected to do and what the other side is going to do, so there's no ambiguity as to what the agreement is about in minute detail, but also that it can be verified in minute detail, that each side is doing what he's supposed to do and has been doing it. Now that we did, I think, assure with respect to the INF agreement, but the final part of it, being sure that there was complete understanding between the two sides and an intention on both sides to go at it correctly, that's hard to do. And to do it for the START agreement is more difficult than I think will be more difficult than it was for the INF agreement, and that was difficult enough.
That's certainly true, sir, but a conventional agreement between the two sides, including multi, the verification problems of a conventional agreement might pale into the sky someplace compared to a strategic nuclear agreement, which is tough, as you say. And yet you seem to think a conventional agreement, I guess, could be verified easier than a nuclear agreement? Is that
Well,
what you're
I guess
suggesting?
I have the feeling that with respect to nuclear weapons, you want to be more precise about it than with conventional weapons, because it takes a lot of conventional weapons to equal and damage one nuclear weapon, so that you can have some roughness in a conventional agreement, but I don't think you want any with respect to the nuclear weapons.
There's a good deal of turmoil in Eastern Europe these days, and particularly in places such as East Germany. I wonder if you comment on whether you think that this sort of turmoil is likely to work in favor or to retard the possibilities of conventional agreement in Europe.
Well, in principle, I would have thought that turmoil is negative toward the prospects of an arms control agreement. But how it works out in this particular case, I'm not sure of. So we're just in the midst of this turmoil. We don't know how it's going to, what the next steps are going to be. I would have thought that the most likely next step will be a renewed attempt by the countries in Central Europe, the communist countries in Central Europe, including the GDR and the USSR, to try to reimpose Soviet communist discipline. That would seem to me to be the likely next step. But I'm not sure of that. You look at there are tremendous uncertainties in this situation. It could go, there are many possibilities. I was in London, and I think one paper was delivered which outlined 8 different alternative scenarios that might progress from here. And the main argument about everybody else was that that man had left out some very relevant scenarios. So I guess before we got through, there must have been 12 or 14 different scenarios that were all possibilities of what might happen next in Central Europe. So that, I think the most probable, the statement that is most probably valid is that it's uncertain. But then within, I guess, the scenario that I think is the most likely is the one that I've described, where the Soviet Union and the other countries the other communist countries try to reimpose a degree of discipline, because I don't think they can tolerate what's going on now without it's leading to chaos. And no organization of any kind wants to see chaos. I guess John Adams was the one who, in his notes on Condorcet and other authors of the Enlightenment, says this is all. Condorcet is saying that the whole history of the world is increasing degrees of freedom, and he says nonsense. He says that when the alternative is chaos, then you have to have a simple form of government. It's only when chaos is not the alternative that a country can afford to have a complex form of government.
Where in this, or in these scenarios that we've been talking about, where does the American interest lie then in Eastern Europe? Is our interest in seeing a restoration of some degree of order there, or is our interest in seeing a continued growth of, you might call pluralism, even if that brings with it some degree of chaos?
It's a question of degree, I think. I mean, if it were to be complete chaos, then that chaos will in fact lead to, I think, to some form of dictatorial government. Because when you're in a situation of chaos, you have to have, I think, a simple form of government. So I would think that if it were to go to chaos, somebody will put some degree of order in it, some military figure or somebody else. But if we can weave through this dangerous period without having it become completely chaotic, then, of course, it is to our interest to see the most liberal forms of government arise in Central Europe that are possible, so that we have a dual objective. We want to see to it that it isn't chaotic, and we want to see that it evolves in something closer to a democratic way than to a dictatorial way.
Let me just follow that up with with one other element of this, and that is the element of nationalism. And we see that much of the chaos or turmoil in that part of the world is not simply a question of liberalization of the government or the economy, but in many cases, rather old ethnic, national antagonisms are coming to the forefront. We see the Romanians persecuting the Hungarians. We see the Bulgarians throwing out the Turks. And we see, of course, within the boundaries of the Soviet Union itself, peoples who feel that they have a grievance against their neighbors or against the central government. I wonder if you might just speculate a little bit about this, the longer run consequences in terms of the American national interests of this seeming revival of nationalism in a part of the world in which, after all, World War I and World War II started.
Paul, before you answer, I have to go
Goodbye.
teach a class, so it's been enjoyable. Thank you.
Clearly, this has been one of the most difficult problems for the USSR and for everybody, the problem of nationalism and the limits to which one should, what limits, if anybody, should be put upon the instincts for nationalism. One does want to be associated with ethnic groups of which one considers oneself to be a part and can consider oneself to be a part. So this is a universal, or more or less universal, drive of all nations that aren't tribal or have some other basis of organization. But certainly there are clearly limits to the degree to which you can make nationalism the summum bonum, the one best and most forceful political outcome. You've got to limit nationalism or it goes too far. You get into conflicting interests of nationalism. And this is clearly true in the USSR today, where the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis are intermingled, and to sort out what is, you can't go give the Azerbaijanis complete national freedom to do everything their instincts tell them to do. I understand that they have a very clear policy, and that is that if the central government in Moscow were to let them, they want to murder all the Armenians that they can get their hands on. So there would be clearly genocide. Clearly that can't be a good outcome. So you have to look at it in a tempered kind of a way. And when it comes to the Baltic states, now after all there, the Balts are not the majority in all those Baltic states. The Russians have come in and the Balts are, by and large, I guess, in a minority, at least in one of them. And, what do you do about that kind of a situation? My own view is that I think we've always been for independence for those countries. We thoroughly disapprove of the way in which the USSR originally seized them. And I would continue to give priority on trying to hope that, or really lean toward giving them independence. And how far one should lean in that direction, I don't know how far I would, if I were in charge, would wish to go day by day. But I do resent, I think it's unwise, the current administration policy to put first trying to help Mr. Gorbachev by helping him put down the drive for independence on those Baltic states. I think it's inconsistent with our past policy, and I don't believe that Mr. Gorbachev is the man that I would make the keystone to our policy in that part of the world. I just wouldn't do that if I were the president. So that it's a complex kind of a problem of how to deal with nationalities in that part of the world. The most sensitive part of it, of course, is the question of the GDR and what fate should eventually be envisaged for the German Democratic Republic. Should the tendencies for it to become again part of Germany, should those tendencies be sympathized with or not sympathized with? I think that's the most difficult political problem we have. I would suggest that the decision in the short run, or when I say short run, for the next 6 to 10 years, would be to be against any reunification of the GDR with the FRG. But then when the other question is asked, would you approve of the European community making it a part of the fundamental constitution of the European community, that there be no reunification between the FRG and the GDR in the long run. I would be against that. It's you can't quite be certain enough as to what's going to happen in the future for me to think that that would be a wise commitment to make on the part of the European community. So that this is one of the complex issues that it's hard to think through as to what side is up from moment to moment. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't some general principles which kind of give you a preliminary guidance, but what you do in detail and specifically here, there, and the other place means you've got a lot to take into account, a lot of different considerations.
Returning somewhat to how we came to this past and your role in it, do you think that the communist experiment is sort of falling of its own weight, or is it now coming apart at the seams because of the policies that the United States has pursued over the last 40 or 45 years?
I don't think it's coming apart wholly as of itself, although that is a factor. Nor do I think it's coming apart wholly because of our containment doctrine. I would say that each has played a part. I think because of our containment policy, it was not possible for the USSR to keep continuously expanding and glorying in that expansion and profiting by the series of new acquisitions and new power centers that it was creating. So that without that addition of new areas recently conquered, I don't believe that it has been possible for them to maintain the momentum that they developed at one time. But certainly I think that our policy of containment has so checked that momentum of expansionism that it was quite normal for them to really look inward and see what the costs were to their own society and to their culture in this enormous expenditure on these vast nuclear forces.
Can I propose to you an interpretation which was offered to me by a member of the U.S. intelligence community, that the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in an arms race, and in the 70s, the Soviet Union was outpacing the United States, and when President Reagan came into office, he made a firm commitment that he simply would not tolerate that, and we would pay whatever price we had to pay to regain at least parity, if not superiority, and the wholesale buildup of our strategic arsenal and our conventional arsenal, for that matter, during the Reagan presidency drove the Soviets against the wall, against the realization that they could no longer endlessly engage in this kind of competition, and that is why they have come to terms, basically. Would you subscribe to something like that?
Well, I'd make the following comments. After all, the first thing the Reagan administration did was to cut the budget from the out-year budget projections, that the Carter administration had submitted to the Congress. So it wasn't the kind of outrageous buildup in military forces that I think most people... I
didn't mean to imply a value judgment about whether it was good or bad, or even who started it, but there has been a buildup in the 80s, and that's what really forced them.
I'm just commenting on how big was the buildup, and I don't really believe it was such a dramatic buildup. My second point would be, I would be surprised if the buildup that did take place, because some buildup did take place, that this was the crucial factor, although I think it may have had a bearing on whether or not they could foresee resuming a pace of armaments which would clearly over time overwhelm us. I don't believe they could any longer aspire to that. But there I would think the main factor was they began to realize how ineffective their economic program really was. It was they were tapping their resources for the future beyond a long-term sustainable pace. So I think they became convinced that they could not any longer compete with the United States in the sense that they were gaining on us. We were gaining on them economically and with the ability to project power.
And along that same line, what role do you think the Strategic Defense Initiative played in bringing about that result? And how do you account for the recent Soviet shift in position on SDI?
I think Mr. Gorbachev was really puzzled by President Reagan. He couldn't imagine that President Reagan would have put that much emphasis upon SDI unless there really had been solid grounds for a belief that it could be made to work. So I think Mr. Reagan, I think Mr. Gorbachev really was taken by surprise that we had so much difficulty making it work. I mean, getting through the research program to a point where there was any process in determining that there was really a real prospect here of making it work.
Mm-hmm.
I think it came as a surprise both to Mr. Reagan and to Mr. Gorbachev that there was so much difficulty in making it work.
I'm wondering if I can probe a little bit on the writing of your memoirs as a historian. These are the kinds of things historians are interested in. When you sat down to do that, what was the process that you went about doing it? To what extent was access to various files in the Defense Department or diaries important? And to what extent did you task out the responsibility or do it yourself or have people do background papers? What was the mechanical process of writing your memoirs?
It was very simple. What I did was take out a yellow pad and begin to write. And I didn't do any research at all. What I did was to rely upon a former secretary who had gotten married, left me, and then wanted to have some kind of a job. And I gave her a job outside my official work, trying to pull files together for me and see whether she could put together all the documentation about things that I'd forgotten about. I never took any files from the government, so that she created a filing cases full of letters and documents and this and that and the other thing. So with her help, she then put into a word processor all these scribbles of mine, and then it became evident that my memory wasn't that good, and so I talked to my friends at Harvard and asked their history department whether they would recommend somebody who would see whether there was any relationship between my recollection and the facts. And they came up with a man who'd been doing some research for the Pentagon and their Department of History.
Steve Reardon?
Steve Reardon, and he was very good indeed. And so when I would scribble something, he would look at it, and he would then look up all the documentation and see whether my memory bore any relationship to fact.
Is the documentation that you use as a basis for jogging your memory somewhere that historians could go to when they wanted to look at the background?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Steve.
I see.
I think it's probably available, yeah.
One last question on the issue of your memoirs. When you were searching your memory to sort of identify those profound intellectual experiences or experiences in public office that affected how you thought about the world or the Soviets, or were there any that stood out?
Well, I was very fortunate because when I was fired so many times and resigned so many times that I had lots of periods and episodes when I was not in the government. And you can think much more objectively about things when you're not in the government, and you really have a better access to people at all levels when you're not in the government than when you are. When you're in the government, the tendency is that you see your peers. There's always one at your level, one level above, and one below, but it's rather looked at as being improper for you to have access to people who are 2 levels above you or 2 levels below. It just doesn't happen. But when you're outside the government, there's no objection at all, and people are prepared to talk to you, whether they're 4 levels, 8 ranks below you, or 8 ranks above you. But everybody is prepared to talk to you when you're outside the government, and no idea is kind of excluded when you're outside the government. When you're in it, you have a narrower viewpoint. So that I think it is extremely valuable to be fired from the government from time to time or to resign, and to do some thinking. And when you get outside the government and really try to think about whether we made the right decisions here, there, the other place, your analysis spreads out, and I think becomes much deeper and more useful. So I had that opportunity from time to time, and largely at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced Studies. So I'd go and teach undergraduates and graduates and so forth and so on. And it's marvelous to have that interchange with students who ask you all the right but unusual questions.
Could I impose upon you one last question about Strobe Talbot's Master of the Game? In spite of the fact that you disagree with some of his interpretations and find them not only wrong but unflattering, it's generally a very flattering book, in fact almost celebratory. And in his review of it, Stanley Hoffman concluded gratuitously, I thought, that the book was wrong-headed because the Cold War would have proceeded much the way it did, whether you played your role or not. First of all, do you think that's a fair observation? And secondly, what do you think your major contributions were? That is, in what ways do you think you made the biggest difference in the way the Cold War proceeded?
Well, I thought, as I look back on it, I think I had a contribution to make to the very initial phases of the Cold War. In those days with Kennan and Boland and Tommy Thompson. I think we laid the intellectual foundation for the program of standing up to the Russians and trying to get something done in this field. And that the real doubt in my mind was whether the country would back such a policy for the indefinite future. After all, the whole proposition of containment was that you'd get public and congressional support for a long continuing program of great cost and sacrifice and danger. After we finished writing NSC 68, we got it done on a Saturday, as I remember it. And I said that, tomorrow, the next day, Sunday, we will meet and we'll spend all day going over this thing and again going through whether we really approve of the recommendations of the report or whether we don't. And I guess I was the one who offered the most vigorous attack on the report itself, and arguing that the chance that public opinion and the Congress would support this doctrine for any extended period of time was almost minimal.
Supposing that the North Koreans had not invaded in June 1950, would NSC 68 have been implemented, do you believe?
It would have been, I think the president would have approved it. I have no doubt about that. He did, in fact, really approve the conclusions, but he wasn't going to officially approve the conclusions until work had been done as to the costs and how was it going to be implemented. I think that was quite proper. But I think it would have been approved even without the attack by the North Koreans into South Korea. But perhaps not at that time, and perhaps certainly not in the magnitude, because I don't believe that the whole budgetary process would have come up with, the $40 billion increase in defense appropriations, which did transpire after the Korean attack. Incidentally, we did do computations ourselves as to what we thought NSC 68 was going to cost. And I came up with, as a result of that work, with a figure of $40 billion a year is what it was going to cost. And so told Atchison. And Atchison said, for goodness sakes, keep that entirely to yourself. Which we did. But it did turn out to be not far from that figure. Sometimes you can get a ballpark figure with some degree of precision that isn't that far from what really is necessary.
I think it was in fact 50 billion is what it came. I think it came to be 50 billion, didn't it, finally?
It did, yeah. But 40 and 50, the same ballpark.
Do you view your contribution in your successive roles to be as significant as that one at the outset? In some ways, having defined the Cold War practically, it's hard to top that. But do you look back upon any other achievement subsequently as being particularly critical? Well,
yes, I would say the development of our policy during the Berlin crisis, which I consider, as I've said earlier, the most dangerous period, the most real possibility of getting ourselves into war. I thought I made a contribution in that. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I thought Alexis Johnson and I made a particularly important contribution to that, because for days during that crisis, the argument was intense, but it was really on the issue of whether it would be moral for us, a great superpower, to take these measures against Cuba, a small power, and wasn't this inherently a bad idea for a great power to really press on a little power? Didn't it put the USSR in the position of being the country that came to the support of a minor power being pressed upon by a great power? And was it right? Wasn't it rather like Pearl Harbor for us to conduct an initial air attack upon Cuba, supposing we were to opt for that option, which was very much in the air? And it was only, I think, due to the fact that Alexis and I one day decided, the problem here was we were arguing this thing from kind of generalities rather than from the standpoint of a specific scenario. That's where our difficulties arose. And that if we could, the two of us, put together a scenario of which P hour was the central time, and then we could figure out what we had to do diplomatically at various time periods before P hour, when the president was to make a speech. It was perfectly clear at some time he was going to have to make a speech describing his policy to the public and to the world. But what had to be done before that speech and what had to be done after that speech, or it could be postponed till after the speech. And similarly with military things, what options for the president did we want to be able to exercise? And here the things that were talked about were, on the one hand, starting with a quarantine or blockade, was I guess the original phrase we used, and moving from that to a surprise attack upon their airfields and their missile facilities, their ground-to-air missile facilities in Cuba, to a direct attack upon the installations for these SS-4s and 5s that they were putting in.
Wasn't there an intermediate step of an ultimatum of sorts before?
Well, I don't remember that playing any important role. Regardless of what your plan was, you could introduce an ultimatum, some notice to them as to what you were doing. But the basic thing we were worried about was what military force would you use, where and how, and what would the progression be. And Alexis and I, after doing this scenario, it seemed that the argument between the sides as to whether you should have a blockade or whether you should have an airstrike or whether you should invade, that all these things sorted themselves out if you looked at it in a time phase scenario. You start with the least use of force, and that is with a blockade, or as it turned out, a quarantine. And if that works, if that causes the Soviets to withdraw their missiles in Cuba, then you really don't have to worry about anything else. If that works, well, then you're home scot-free. If it doesn't work, what do you do then? You have to tighten the quarantine and add things to it other than just the offensive missiles. And if that doesn't work, then you have to consider taking out the missiles that protect the ground-to-surface missiles, ground-to-air missiles that protect the installations. And if that doesn't cause the result you want, then you've got to consider taking out the missile sites themselves. But if that doesn't work, then you've got to be prepared to invade and just eliminate these sites and cause Cuba to, so you can go all over the island and see to it that there isn't any remaining force there. But if you look at it as a time phase scenario, clearly the first thing you want to do is to have the quarantine. And if that doesn't work, then you want to have these airstrikes. And if that doesn't work, then you want to invade. Everybody agreed with that the moment you laid it out in that phase with all the political things in a time phase scenario. And we got Ted Sorensen to write the draft of speech that the president would make on P hour Ted was cross at us. He said, the committee hasn't made any recommendations of what the policies should be. We said, forget about that. Just write a good speech, and we'll give you the rough outlines of it, which we did. And he wrote a brilliant speech, a first draft. And so then when we met with Ted's speech and this scenario, everybody found themselves more or less in agreement. It was all got straightened out.
Well, I think these closing comments on your contributions to this very rich and intriguing history of the last 45 years is perhaps a good point in which to end. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Living History Program and my fellow panelists for a stimulating 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you.
for this opportunity.